Today we're going to be talking about watercolor tips for beginners. So some of the terminology that we're going to go over are paints, paper, paintbrushes, palettes, pencils and erasers, and other things or other materials that's good for watercolor. So I know today, if you go to the store, there's so many options that you can choose from. And for a beginner, it can be quite nerve-wracking. Or if you're like me, I go into the store and I'm impulsive and I buy everything, sometimes two of the same thing. But we find that you only need a few basic items to create the paintings that you want. So in this presentation, I'm going to go over the basic items that you need so that you can go ahead and get started painting the best watercolor paintings that you can do. So to start off, we're going to talk about the different types of watercolor paints. Watercolor paints come in dry cakes, which are just blocks of pigment. They come in pans. Pans are semi-moist wells of paint. And they also come in tubes. So for the cake and the pan paints, you would have to loosen the pigment by stroking over it with a wet brush. If you use the tube paints, they are already kind of like liquidy. They're not dry, and you can just take a little bit and mix it with water. With the tube paints, it's easier to create more intense washes that are larger. And I believe that the tube paints are easier on your brushes because there's very little scrubbing that's required. And if you're working outside, it's easier to use tube paints because you can touch up with the tube as needed. So next up is paper. So it's always important to use a good quality watercolor paper. If you just have what's available to you, that works well as well. So there's a different range of textures that can be used when it comes to watercolor paper. And those textures are hot pressed, which is a smoother paper, cold press. This one has like a medium type of texture. It's in between smooth and rough. And then you have rough, which is just, it has what we call toots, which are these indents in it. That creates this kind of rough texture. Like you can really feel it when you put your hand to it. So for depending on the painting that you use, you might have to use either or when it comes to the different types of watercolor paper ranges. I do have a video that talks about watercolor techniques, and that goes more in depth onto what type of paper you should or shouldn't use. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is the type of palette that you can use when doing watercolor. So typically, a palette tray is a good palette to use for watercolor. With a palette tray, you can squeeze the paint on the edge of the tray. And in the middle of the tray, you can put dabs of water and you can spread out your watercolor mix. And it's also important to try to look for a paint palette that is wide and deep when it comes to the wells. This is important just so that you're able to thoroughly dip your brushes into it, depending on the type of wash or depending on the type of watercolor technique or painting that you're going for. So when it comes to this, I don't have a brand to recommend, but try to go to your local art store and look to see what they have, or you can improvise. And if you have a tray at home, you can use the tray. So another thing to talk about when it comes to watercolors are pencils and erasers. So pencils that are labeled with numbers and letters, they are used to indicate the level of hardness or softness of the pencil. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're using a pencil to create a sketch before you start to do your watercolor wash, you want to understand the letters and numbers on the pencil so that you can better understand what pencil you need to do to complete your sketch. So if a pencil has an H on it, that means that it's hard. And if a pencil has a B, on it that indicates that the pencils are soft. Now, the higher the accompanying number on the pencil, the more intense the hardness or softness. So it's very important that when you're using the pencil, you want to use as gentle a pressure that you can use. So be very light. And you want to try to use a soft pencil when you're doing your sketches on the watercolor. Because if you use a hard pencil, it could be too light to see through the washes and it could easily like damage the surface of the paper. I do have a video with watercolor techniques that talks more about it. But yeah, so remember to use minimal pressure and to try to go with a more soft pencil. I know it's a soft brush. I'm sorry, I mean pencil. So the other materials that you might want to consider when doing a watercolor art piece is to have some paper towels around. Paper towels are good for wiping your work surface and they're good for lifting color from a painting. If you have a small bucket, you can use it to hold water so that you don't have to keep getting up to get more or less water. Tape is really good because the tape will allow you to make a border around the edge of your painting. And it's easy to prevent tears with tape. You can use it to stretch your paper so that your paper doesn't buckle when you have to do a wet on wet technique. And you can just use a hairdryer to warm the tape before removing it so that it doesn't rip your watercolor paper. And with that being said, a hairdryer is good for just warming the glue on the tape before removing it, and it can be used to dry your painting. And then lastly, it's really good to use a craft knife to sharpen your pencils because it allows you to expose more graphite and to cleanly cut the wood on any of the pencils that you might be using for sketching. So I hope that helps. And then one of the things that I wanted to discuss was a workspace. I know sometimes we don't always have a place where we can work. So you want to try to assign a little space where you can work. It could be a desk, it could be a room, a corner of the room, a table, just somewhere where you can work. You want to have a flat surface that you're comfortable working on. And again, set aside enough room in your space to place your supplies so that it's easy for you to grab what you may or may not need when painting. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video.